Season 1 of Interview with the Vampire begins in the year 2022. Journalist Daniel Molloy is called to Dubai to conduct the world's first public interview with the vampire Louis de Pointe du Lac. Daniel is skeptical of Louis's motives and openness, as 49 years prior, Daniel had previously tried to interview the vampire, which ended in a violent attack. Despite this, Daniel arrives at Louis's new home in Dubai, where the interview officially begins, and Louis recounts his history as a vampire. In 1910, the still mortal Louis is a pimp who owns and operates brothels throughout New Orleans. Louis's religious family, especially his younger brother Paul, are disheartened by his choice of career and pray for his and his patrons' souls. Eventually, Louis meets and befriends the stranger Lestat de Lioncourt. As the pair grow closer, they share a kiss, and Lestat reveals his true nature as a vampire, seductively biting Louis's neck and levitating him into the air. Louis is overwhelmed by this show of power and abandons Lestat in fear and shame. Following the wedding of their sister Grace, Paul has a mental breakdown over all of the changes in his and his family's lives, ultimately leading to his death. Louis's mother blames him for the death, leading to Louis angrily abandoning his family. A depressed and drunken Louis seeks the help of a priest, confessing his past sins and believing that sleeping with a devil like Lestat has led to all of his inner turmoil. Lestat then arrives and kills the priest, then confesses to having killed many other innocent humans around New Orleans. Lestat explains that he recognized Louis's repressed shame and sorrow from the moment he first saw him, having been able to hear his thoughts and know his darkest desires. At his lowest point, Louis accepts Lestat's offer to be turned into a vampire, in the hopes of feeling powerful and free for the first time in his life. Lestat then begins training Louis in the ways of the vampire, including helping him commit his first kill. In learning his new rules of life, Louis discovers that vampires can't feed on dead people, where they could get sick and die, they can't go out in the sun or they will burn, and vampires possess the ability to listen to people's thoughts, though Lestat confesses that he can no longer hear Louis's thoughts due to being his maker. 5 years later, Louis has become comfortable in his vampire abilities and pays a visit to his family. Grace now has 3 children, but while holding her youngest baby, Louis feels compelled to feed on it, and so Louis runs away from his family, scared he will harm them due to his uncontrollable urges. Despite their continued romantic love for each other, Louis grows wary of Lestat's more callous view toward humans, like casually killing and feeding on an opera singer just for having a pitchy performance. Louis tries to reform Lestat, insisting that they only feed on humans who are morally corrupt. As Louis begins emotionally pulling away, Lestat takes a new lover, Antoinette. In the present, Louis claims to Daniel that he hasn't preyed on humans in more than 2 decades. Instead, his thirst is quenched by his loyal human assistant and lover, Rashid. Back in 1917, the city's racist alderman Fenwick begins extorting and driving out black-owned businesses, allowing his wealthy white elitist friends to buy the properties for pennies on the dollar. An angered Louis kills Fenwick and displays his mutilated body in public for all to see. Unfortunately, this leads to racist white mobs beginning to burn down black homes and businesses in retaliation. As Louis attempts to save those in danger from the mob, he comes across the young girl Claudia and rescues her from a fire. Claudia is horribly burned from the fire, leading a desperate Louis to turn to Lestat and beg him to turn the girl into a vampire. The young Claudia is impulsive and reckless, and grows frustrated about being eternally damned to remain a child forever. As Louis and Lestat train Claudia in the ways of the vampire, she becomes like a surrogate daughter to them, rekindling their relationship. Despite this, Lestat grows jealous over Louis's closeness to the girl. As Claudia and Louis's maker, Lestat can read neither of their thoughts, allowing the pair their own personal connection. The impulsive Claudia then goes on a killing spree, though mistakenly buries the bodies of her victims in too shallow ground. When a storm unearths the bodies, the police turn their attention toward Louis and Lestat as suspects. As the pair scold Claudia for her recklessness, the girl professes her desire to seek out other vampires to live with. Lestat warns her against this, as it is forbidden to create a child vampire, and Claudia would be killed due to being seen as a mistake. Despite this, Claudia runs away, but not before informing Louis of Lestat's continued affair with Antoinette. For the next 7 years, Louis and Lestat's relationship deteriorates, as Louis blames Lestat for Claudia's departure. In Claudia's independent adventures, she eventually meets a fellow young vampire named Bruce, and although they first seem to get along along, Bruce eventually proves himself to be violent and abusive. In his present-day interview with Daniel, Louis refuses to go into any further details about Claudia's experiences with Bruce, not wanting to exploit her trauma. Eventually, Claudia returns home and realizes that Louis had her turn into a vampire to fill the void left by his beloved sister. Claudia informs Louis of her desire to travel to Europe to explore vampire history and begs Louis to come with her, claiming that unlike Lestat, she is actually worthy of his love. This enrages Lestat, who attacks Claudia. Louis steps in to protect Claudia and engages in a brutal fight with his lover, culminating in Lestat flying Louis high into the air, bemoaning that he has waited too long for Louis to love him unconditionally, and then allowing Louis to plummet to the ground. 6 years later, Lestat returns from a self-imposed exile, professing to have become a better person and begging desperately for Louis to give him another chance. Despite Claudia's warnings, Louis is won over by a music album that Lestat had created as an ode to their love. Claudia allows Lestat back into her and Louis' lives on the condition that he follow her new rules, treating Claudia like an equal, killing Antoinette to put a permanent end to their affair, and vowing to never lie again. As more time passes, Louis learns that not only did Lestat lie about killing Antoinette, he has also continued his affair with her. Claudia tries once again to convince Louis to leave New Orleans with her to travel the world, but Louis is resigned to his fate and bids her an emotional farewell. Unfortunately, Lestat intervenes to capture Claudia and return her home, threatening to do worse to her than Bruce ever did if she ever tried to leave again, as her presence makes Louis happy. Now basically living as Lestat's slave, Claudia telepathically communicates to Louis her desire to kill Lestat to finally be free of his manipulative and controlling grasp. Reluctantly, Louis agrees to join Claudia in her mission. As the residents of New Orleans grow more antagonistic toward the seemingly ageless Louis and Lestat, Lestat decides it is time his makeshift family depart the city to find a new home. Claudia convinces Lestat to throw a massive Mardi Gras themed going away party and invite local elites that they could then feast on. At the party, Claudia informs Louis that she had secretly drugged one of their potential victims with arsenic and laudanum to poison Lestat with. But as Lestat, Louis, and Claudia begin feeding on their victims, Antoinette arrives, having been turned into a vampire by Lestat, and exposes Claudia's plan. Fortunately, Claudia had planned for this, revealing that Lestat had already fed on the poisoned victim. As Lestat collapses in pain, Louis slits his throat, while Claudia kills Antoinette. Unable to bring himself to burn Lestat's body, Louis instead abandons him in the dump before departing New Orleans with Claudia to start new lives in Europe. In the present, Daniel confronts Louis with the knowledge that he purposefully sent Lestat to the dump so that he could feed on rats and regain his strength. For all of his supposed candidness, Daniel believes that Louis' recounting of events are softened to make his and Lestat's actions sound less violent and problematic. Rashid rebukes Daniel's judgmental nature toward vampires, and then begins floating in the air to reveal himself as an ancient vampire, leading to a shocked Daniel finally remembering that the unaging Rashid had been present during Louis' first attempted interview 49 years prior. When Daniel questions how he could have witnessed Rashid standing in the sun, Rashid explains that the older vampires get, the less the sun affects them. And so, in the end, Louis proudly stands by Rashid and reveals that his true name is Armand, an ancient vampire and the love of Louis' life. In Season 2, Louis continues his interview with Daniel Molloy, but is now joined by Armand as a fellow subject. Secretly in between sessions, Daniel is approached by a man named Raglan James who works for the Talamasca, a secret society whose goal is to protect the world from supernatural threats. Raglan warns Daniel that vampires are exponentially growing in number around the world, and gives him files on Louis and Armand for info they won't offer up in their interview statements. Louis continues his interview by recounting his journey with Claudia to Europe, which is in the midst of recovering from the turmoil of World War II. Louis remains haunted by his guilt for his actions against Lestat, straining his relationship with Claudia. In Paris, Louis and Claudia catch the attention of a local coven of vampires led by none other than Armand. Armand makes himself known to the pair and introduces them to his coven of artists performing at the Theatre de Vampires. Claudia is transfixed by the vampires' public performances, where the lead actor actor, the vampire Santiago, displays his full vampiric powers in front of a human crowd and even feasts on an innocent woman on stage. The audience is awed by this act, not realizing that everything they are witnessing is real. Louis and Claudia are shocked to discover that Lestat himself was a co-founder of the theater, and so they lie about their attempts to kill him and instead claim that their maker was the vampire Bruce. Claudia takes an immediate liking to the coven, who make her feel pride in being a vampire for the first time. Armand grows close to Louis, who confesses that Lestat is his true maker. In turn, Armand recounts his own history with the manipulative vampire. In the year 1556, Armand had been sent by his coven in Rome to lead the struggling vampires in Paris. 2 centuries later, he met the newly turned Lestat, who gleefully shirked the many great vampire laws. Having grown tired of his coven's oppressive rules, Armand invited Lestat to join them, in the hopes he could help convince the others to abandon their outdated ideals. Armand and Lestat then fell in love and formed the Theatre de Vampires together, before Lestat abruptly abandoned Armand and the others, though left behind enough money to fund the theater in perpetuity. Armand's heartbreak over Lestat lasted centuries, until the day he met Louis, and his heart began to soften once again. Meanwhile, Claudia is excitedly inducted as an official member of the coven, vowing not to break any of their great laws. Louis chooses to remain independent, though after killing a man he hallucinated as Lestat, attention is drawn to the coven. For endangering the coven, Louis is sentenced to death, and although Louis accepts his fate as the leader of the coven, Armand chooses not to kill him, instead professing his love and leading to the two sharing a kiss. As time passes, Claudia begins leading the coven's new play, in which she acts as a baby. Wanting more than anything to be able to grow out of her eternal adolescence, Claudia begins resenting the role. She finds support in her new mentor Santiago, who criticizes Armand for his lack of focus on the coven, to instead spend all of his time with Louis, a vampire who's been allowed to break the great laws without consequence. In trying to appease the coven by playing a more active role, Armand becomes strict and overbearing toward Claudia, forcing her to dress as a baby even when not acting in the play, and threatening her with the knowledge that Lestat is her true maker. This causes great tension between Claudia and Louis, as Claudia believes that Louis has chosen Armand over her, while Louis believes that Claudia has chosen the coven over him. In the present, Armand departs for a hunt, allowing Daniel to briefly shift his focus toward his first interview with Louis from 1973. Back then, Louis took the young Daniel to his apartment where they took drugs and bonded. As Louis first recounted his time in New Orleans with Lestat and Claudia, Daniel responded by asking to be turned into a vampire, growing tired of the mundanity of human existence. Viewing his life as a cautionary tale, Louis grew angry at Daniel's request and attacked him. Although that is all either Louis or Daniel remember from that night, Daniel plays an audio clip that the Talamasca had secretly recovered from the interview recording. That clip reveals that Armand intervened to save Daniel's life, though the drugged-up Louis lashed out at his lover, claiming their life together is boring. Armand angrily fired back at Louis, knowing he was still hung up on both Lestat and Claudia. This sends Louis over the edge, choosing to leave the apartment during the day and subject himself to the deadly sun. Armand saved Louis' life and nursed him back to health. Jealous of Louis' openness with him, Armand tortured Daniel, but the injured Louis intervened to save him, imparting words of encouragement that Daniel has cherished to this day. Now bitter over Louis' interview about his ex, Armand telepathically reached out to Lestat to inform him of Louis' weakened condition. Lestat asked Armand to relay his undying love for Louis, but Armand chose to keep this secret. In the present, Louis and Daniel realize that Armand manipulated their memories to forget these events. And so when Armand returns from his hunt, he is greeted bitterly by the pair. And though Armand earns Louis' forgiveness, reminding him that he asked to have his memories of the traumatic event erased, Daniel remains bitter. Back in Paris, Claudia develops feelings for a kind dressmaker named Madeleine, who has become a pariah due to her past affair with a Nazi soldier, in exchange for valuable supplies during the war. When a group of people attack Madeleine, Claudia intervenes to save her, slaughtering them all and revealing her true nature as a vampire. Madeleine professes her own romantic feelings for Claudia, leading to Claudia asking for Louis' help and turning her new lover into a vampire. And so, Louis turns Madeleine, allowing her and Claudia to be united for for eternity. Inspired by this act, Armand chooses to leave the coven to be with Louis, allowing Santiago to claim the control he has long desired. Unfortunately, Armand then relents in allowing Santiago and the coven to capture Claudia, Madeleine, and Louis, charging them with breaking many of the vampire's great laws. Santiago forces the trio to take part in an onstage trial at the theater, watched by a crowd of humans believing everything to be scripted, where they face charges for their many crimes, including the attempted killing of the Vampire Lestat. During the trial, Santiago reads excerpts from Claudia's diary to prove her premeditated guilt, while Lestat himself arrives as a witness, confronting Louis for the first time since his near death. While following along in Santiago's plot to incriminate Louis, Lestat does eventually break down in tearful shame when recounting the time he fought Louis and let him drop from such great heights. But Lestat then composes himself and argues that Louis and Claudia were little more than ungrateful children who violently turned against their adoring father. As the trial reaches its verdict, Claudia and Madeleine are both sentenced to death. Louis is charged for his crimes, but Armand uses all of his ancient vampiric strength to telepathically overwhelm the coven and force them to spare Louis's life. In the end, the heartbroken Louis helplessly watches as Claudia and Madeleine are subjected to the sun, turning to ashes in each other's arms, though Claudia remains strong and defiant, even in death. Armand then helps Louis escape the coven, but instead of fleeing to safety, Louis plots violent revenge. He burns down the theater and slaughters every single member of the coven, relishing the death of Santiago most of all. Armand apologizes to Louis for helping the coven, explaining his fears that Louis's love for him would not last as long as the coven's loyalty. But now he pledges to dedicate his life to earning back Louis's trust. The pair track down Lestat, and though Louis wants to kill his maker to avenge Claudia, he instead settles on an even crueler punishment, proclaiming his love for Armand and ensuring that Lestat will never have control over him again. And with that, Louis concludes his interview, having never seen Lestat since. Using intel given to him by the Telemasca and the lone surviving coven member Sam, Daniel shockingly reveals that Armand himself was the director of the trial, having orchestrated the entire production with the intention of killing Louis, choosing the coven's desires over his own love. Louis is devastated by this revelation, and as he storms out of his apartment, he attacks Armand and destroys Daniel's laptop, erasing all evidence of their interview. With Louis gone, Armand spitefully turns Daniel into a vampire, knowing it is against Louis's wishes. Louis then seeks out Lestat, who confirms that he had saved Louis's life during the trial and has lived in deep sorrow ever since for his part in Claudia's death. And so, at their lowest points, Louis and Lestat embrace, finding comfort in each other for the first time in more than 70 years. In the end, Daniel publishes his book, Interview with the Vampire, to massive commercial success. Though with all evidence of the actual interview destroyed, most view the writing as a work of fiction. Despite this, vampires from around the world are furious at Louis for breaking the great law of exposing vampire secrets to the human world. As they prepare to retaliate against him, Louis confidently calls them all to his location, ready to take on everyone. Thanks for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and why not check out this recommended video while you're at it.